I wrote this book largely because there are so many books out there about leadership, and I don't want to in any way try and add to that grouping of books. This is a book about what it really is behind the scenes to be a CEO, which I thought was missing. So after 35 years of counseling CEOs, I thought it was really important to sort of, talk about what the real life, day-to-day, month-to-month challenges are of being a CEO in a ways that most leadership books do not. All the CEOs who leave and write biographies are always wonderfully remembering all the great things they did and how it all came to pass. And they really forget all of the potholes they hit and all the headwinds they encountered over their careers. And I wanted to bring a little bit of that reality to at least the conversation. So in some respects, that's really the background behind the book. You'll find it, and you'll find me full of very practical, down-to-earth, not particularly lofty ideas, because what really works in the world of leadership tends to be the things that are short passes that are well-received and acted upon, not the big, showy, big grand gestures. And that's really where I'm going to spend much of our time today with Jonathan. I want to just make sure that we all understand the challenge of leadership as CEOs. I quote here a Korn Ferry study, which already tells you what you already know, which is that the time frame for tenures of CEOs is declining rapidly. It used to be that you'd have long tenured, well-performing CEOs. That is not the case anymore. Indeed, it's almost become the standard that boards will say, look, at the best way to deal with a crisis or a poor situation with regard to earnings is to change out leadership, where that would not have been the case before. So right now, the average tenure of most CEOs is under 6 years, in some cases much shorter. So if that wasn't bad enough, there's just a host of issues that CEOs now have to deal with that they previously did not have to deal with, even beyond just the whole digitization and other institutional and things happening. One is clearly you now have a whole raft of people who are commenting on and suggesting how they should be spending their time. BlackRock is, of course, prominent amongst them. There are many others. CLS, for all I know, is doing the same thing, which is saying, look at what are you doing, not just about shareholders, what are you doing about stakeholders, and what are you doing about social enterprises, climate change, and so on. You also have activism. Here are 4 very prominent activists. There's now a host of activism-led industry that is always challenging any CEO. Any leader who is accumulating cash is immediately worried that an activist is going to take a position and force their hand. So there's real pressure on them for that. We have to recognize the whole social movement that comes with diversity and inclusion and the Me Too movement. All of this probably should have happened much sooner and much more aggressively in terms of the embracement of diversity and inclusion. It is now a key conversation on every board and every CEO, as it should be, but yet another challenge. Then, of course, at least in the United States and in many parts of the world, you have the social divide that's coming as a result of political belief systems and how contrasting those are. So we see that play out every day now, certainly in the United States and then also in many other countries outside the United States. Add to that the pandemic, which is incredibly challenging as it is for everybody worldwide. And if that wasn't bad enough, now we have to worry about vaccines. On the board meetings I've been on for the last 2 months, the whole question we spend hours on is whether or not and how to respond to the vaccine challenges of industry. So imagine every CEO is having to deal with all those issues in addition to just getting the job done that they were hired to do. So this is going to be a really tough job. It was already tough, now it's really tough. So, there certainly are the key challenge here is that all of the things that people do to become a CEO, and there are many things you have to do to climb the ladder, as this graphic tries to indicate, to become a CEO. You have to become a great general manager, you have to become a strategist, you have to become an M&A specialist. Well, that's great. The problem is they have little value once you become a CEO, because the leadership needs of being a CEO are not those that you are you're learning and executing as you went up the sort of ladder of success to become a CEO. You have to learn a whole bunch of new skills. And that's really where this book talks to, is that transition. In order to do that, the book focuses on 14 different sort of areas of challenge. Jonathan said we can only focus on a few of them. So we've chosen today to focus on the notion of truth, the notion of the board, and the notion of how you do well in terms of the context of social enterprise and diversity. Just to quickly set the stage for those on truth, I think we could best summarize the issue with truth and leadership by Admiral Stavridis, who told me, I attribute this story to him. I don't know where he got the story. It might have been him as well. He's a former NATO commander, now at Carlisle. But he always said to me, look, when I visited the bridge of a major aircraft carrier and I went to meet with the senior staff of the aircraft carrier or battleship, he said, I know two things with absolute certainty. I would never be handed a cold cup of coffee, and I would never get the entire truth of what was happening on the ship. And that is a great way for you to think about CEOs. They are never going to get a cold cup of coffee because their staff will always be there, but they are not going to get the entire truth. That's one of the things we should probably talk about. Jonathan may ask me some questions about that. Getting on board with your board. This is a list you do not want to be on. This is a list that you just don't want to ever be on. And these are just a few examples of the types of things that are challenging boards. And I just highlight a few words that you also never want to be on a board that has this said about you: fraudulent, cheating software at VW, poor discipline control of your founder or your CEO, as happened in WeWork, falsifying customer accounts, as happened in Wells Fargo. $5 billion worth of losses because you don't have risk management control on your traders at Credit Suisse. The poor oversight of safety protocols at Boeing, which has been plaguing them for a year and probably another 2 years. And GE, questionable approaches, buying at the top of the power curve in terms of their acquisitions, just to choose one of their challenges. These are things you never want to be associated with, and CEOs and boards don't want to. We should probably talk about what makes a good board. Finally, there's an earnings conundrum, which we have to be aware of that CEOs face. BlackRock, as you well know, Vanguard and State Street and large numbers of others in the European shareholder community are saying, look, we believe and appropriately believe that sustainability risk is now an investment risk, and we're going to actually hold you accountable for issues around sustainability. It also could be around diversity and inclusion. It could also include support of communities in a number of other ways. So that's now out there. So you have stakeholder requirements. The problem is nobody's forgotten about the shareholder requirements, and none of you probably want them to, because you want them to continue to deliver earnings. And so that's a conundrum that CEOs have to deal with. And if you don't think it's happening, I just 3 days ago, I pulled this right off the Wall Street Journal. Classic example. Kroger has a spill in aisle 5 is the article. After an impressive run, supermarket chain shares dropped after missing bottom line expectations for the quarter. You see this all the time. Every day you see this. This is a 5% drop in their share price because they missed their earnings, even though we're probably doing great things with regard to sustainability and other issues that BlackRock asked them to. So hopefully that sets the stage for the types of things that I think we should talk about and are certainly in the book. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan and be available to you and to him for questions.
All right. Well, before we open it up to the audience, let's maybe start digging into those 3 chapters. Kicking off with the first one about avoiding half-truths and misconceptions. Can you talk about the pitfalls and what the outside world may not fully appreciate about the challenges that these CEOs face? Certainly, if you're running a business and you don't know half of what's going on and the people around you aren't being fully honest, it's very easy to appreciate how the CEOs can't do their jobs. Can you just talk a little bit more about that and what the outside world and the investment community can learn from that?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to recognize history is just laden with examples of where leaders were not told the entire truth and therefore disasters occurred. And so this is not a surprising finding, I think. On the other hand, it is one that is surprising often for leaders in the micro context of their environments, where they think, look, I'm a trusted, authentic, open person. I see myself that way. So of course my team is going to tell me everything I need to know. There's 2 problems with that. One is, as much as you're trusted, open, and transparent, you believe you aren't actually viewed that way by your team. So better look in the mirror and really question whether or not you are as you say you are, because most leaders think they're more transparent, more open and more engaging than they truly are. So that's one just harsh reality for all of us. We all think we're, please tell me more when you actually are saying, tell me less. And so that's a real challenge. Second is illustrated by when I did the interviews for this book, I would say to people, I give them the list of the chapters and say, are these relevant and are these meaningful? Almost every CEO to a person said that one about hidden truths is really important. You have to tell that to all new CEOs, because that was my biggest surprise. Now, of course, my situation has now changed. And they tell me everything, which I, of course, know was not the truth either. So it's also, they can be in denial themselves. So this is a human nature problem. It is a fundamental aspect of people who are reporting to others who say, look, I don't feel like you really want to know everything. I'll tell you what you asked me to tell you. I will then rely on others to fill in the mosaic so that you can see the whole picture.
Okay. Maybe transitioning there to the second chapter, or that we want to discuss about the boards. Obviously, the relationship between the board and CEO is very powerful, and it's something that typically happens outside of the eye of the public, be that the investment community, the news press, buy side, sell side, whatever it may be. Can you talk about the attributes of a healthy relationship that would exist between the board and the CEO?
Yeah, I think, what you would see internally, which is hard to see from external. So let's talk about what should happen internally. Then we'll talk about how you can actually sense whether or not that's happening. Internally, the board, CEOs who treat their board as a value-added portion of their leadership, that value them and are, and view them as a somebody to be inclusive, to have an inclusive relationship with, is powerfully important. There are many situations in the years that I was consulting to boards and then now being on boards, where I could see that the board management becomes the issue, which is the CEOs don't do that. They actually say, how do we manage our board? If the moment you have that thought, that is a challenge, because that means you're trying to actually, manage them, focus them into different arenas and not be in other arenas. And how do they do that? I mean, listen, this is really simple stuff. I was on a board meeting just last week. I had all the pre-reading. It was 600 pages of pre-reading. So if you want to hide things from me, send me 600 pages of reading and expect me to figure it all out, because very little of it comes with an executive summary that says, here's what's important. And so I'm just telling you, the reality of what happens with inside the CEO board relationship is sometimes troublesome. The really good boards, that isn't the case. The boards are really very aligned and very working together. Now, how can you as an outsider know that that's happening? One is look at the lead director. The lead director is really important, because not only because he or she is obviously playing a very important oversight role, but she or he is also somebody who's guiding the board. And if that lead director is somebody who's close to the CEO, has been part of their network for years, actually worked at together at a previous company, that should be a warning sign to you, because that you want the lead director to not be the CEO's best friend. You want the lead director to be a lead director, which is part of the sort of management governance oversight. You want to really make sure that you look at where and how the board is meeting. If you could find that out, you can understand. So if the board is actually meeting every meeting at the corporate headquarters and rarely travels to go outside and see a facility or talk to the management that is at a major operating manufacturing facility or distribution facility, that also is a warning bell. That means that they're really sitting in judgment of and just always getting input from and never going out and touching and feeling. I remember my father used to be on Texas Instruments board, a company of all, still in existence today. And the TI board always went out every other board member meeting, and were always in the field. They were always talking to and spending time with people in the organization. Great boards do that. So that's another indication. You can also look at who's coming and going from the board. For an example, I'm on the board of Leidos. Recently, about 4 years ago, at the end of the previous administration, Frank Kendall joined our board. Frank will be embarrassed that I'm talking to him, but Frank Kendall joined our board from the procurement area, the Defense Department. Now he was on our board for almost 4.5 years, and now has just been selected to become the Secretary of the Air Force, a major, powerful position in the defense arena of the United States. And he's going off to do that. Well, that shows that we have a quality board. Not that so much that we are losing Frank, but the fact is that we could attract him, have him, and now have him also be valued enough that he's going back into the world, which was quite important to Leidos as a government contractor. So I think sometimes you can look at the coming and goings from a board. It requires you to be a little investigative, you know, and to ask questions about the board, mainly around content, membership, and quality. Lastly, I would say if you look at the board and you see only, you sort of quote, professional board members, people who are on many other boards, that's a problem. You really want to have people that you might actually say, who are those? Who's that? Well, because they're people who really understand the industry, and that's terrific.
Okay. I'm going to have a few other questions for you about maybe looking at evaluating CEOs and
Sure.
boards. But before we get there, the third chapter we wanted to talk about, I think, is incredibly important. A lot of those names that you put on that list, BlackRock, Vanguard, that list is a very long list. Some of those people may actually be on this call.
Sure, you should be.
You know, so in the sense that, you know, you've got this competing factors here between stakeholders, you know, and very important concepts, as you say about ESG, diversity, inclusion, and balancing that against, you know, shareholder returns. As you think through this, you know, what's your advice for a CEO in terms of how you balance those stakeholders? And do you see a point where compensation for CEOs begins to diverge from just share price performance, and it would start to look at other factors as well?
Yeah, so let's take them in turn. First of all, okay. That what you're describing is not just a new normal, it's an appropriate normal, and it's wonderful that's happening. I think most CEOs and leaders would tell you they agree with that. Though the conundrum I spoke of earlier is very real, which is that they have to realize that there are very often trade-offs between what they can do to optimize shareholder interests to ensure that stakeholder interests are also maximized. Now, there have been many studies by my former consulting firm and by McKinsey, and also Harvard has done several. I know many others have as well, which says, listen, that's a false trade-off. If you do great in terms of your social impact, you will do great for your shareholders, and therefore they will be aligned. I must tell you, I'm not so sure that all CEOs believe that. You know, so there's still a fight within themselves as to how to balance these. And I think it's a very real conundrum that they wrestle with. So I think that the reality of it is that this is and will continue to be a struggle. You know, I think best illustrated by, I'm well aware of somebody who is a very active player in the Business Roundtable letter that went out that said, here's our new belief system, here's our prioritization. Shareholders and stakeholders are the same in terms of what we are going to spend our time worried about. And then went to their board and said, look, I've signed this letter because I believe this, but don't worry, I won't miss our next quarter's earnings at all. So that's the fundamental conundrum that you're going to sense that's happening in this. So I think that's certainly out there. Now, what can you do about it? Is that what you'd like to now talk about, or how to see it?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, you know, go ahead, please, Jonathan.
No. Yes, and also about the compensation of CEOs. Should you know? Do you believe this will start to change over time to recognize these other important factors?
Yeah, I think for the most part, it is already changing in terms of how you know, boards are actually choosing to evaluate not just their CEO, but the senior leadership team. For the most part now, it tends to be a qualitative component of their formulaic compensation, which says, look, we have to have sort of a qualitative assessment of how well you're doing in terms of a variety of different requirements for social impact. Those include, what are you doing about climate change initiatives? How much are you trying to, and where are you on your zero emissions sort of strategy? Where are you on diversity and inclusion? And where are you in terms of broader community objectives, which were appropriate for whatever community you're a part of? Those things are now being baked in a qualitative way for most CEOs. So they spend, and they do require a lot of attention. They have yet to be easily quantified. And so putting them into the actual formulas that actually go to compensation is harder, because remember, internally, most boards will use a benchmarks against other like companies that they follow, so they can do a comparative. It's done annually, it's done by third parties. And until the third parties actually who help do this analysis of like type of companies change their approach, it'll be very hard for boards to feel comfortable they can change their approach with their CEOs. So the change in compensation will happen more slowly than will the activity around it, but it's happening now. I just think it's not quite as discernible because it's not baked into the formulas that they're using.
Right.
In terms of the what you can do about it, is that the first is most leaders are saying, look, I need to stop thinking of it as a trade-off. I have to embrace it and evaluate. That has now been the sea change. I would say that much of this work, that activism that BlackRock, yourselves, others are doing has been very valuable. It's basically said, we're not going to alleviate the pressure. And so that pressure is certainly felt. There is not a discussion that happens now at a board about a new board member that does not include how are we making sure that we have a greater representation from underrepresented minorities. That is on every conversation that is now had. That is not the case 5 years ago. It was just not. And that's because of this pressure that's being brought to it. And I think the other is that you have to increasingly put out measurements for what you can measure. So, obviously in the climate change arena, it's a lot easier to measure than it is in the diversity and inclusion. Because while you can look at the numbers of underrepresented minorities in your management team, the trouble is that it actually requires, in some cases, turnover to create opportunities to hire those people. And somehow you don't want turnover in order to create an opportunity to bring in others. So, and it takes time. And because we want cohorts of people to be created, that will take time. So the climate change initiatives will have greater quantification than will the diversity and inclusion ones, is my view.